I know how this ends. I know because I was the one who ended it. But to understand why I did what I did, in front of 200 people, on the most important day of my daughter's life, you have to go back to the moment I first shook his hand and thought, something is wrong with this man's eyes. My name is Margaret, and I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a licensed pharmacist in Asheville, North Carolina. I know medications. I know dosages. I know what certain combinations do to the human body, and I know how to read the fine print that most people never bother with. My late husband, Gerald, used to say I was the only woman he'd ever met who read ingredient labels the way other people read novels. He meant it as a compliment. After everything that happened, I think it saved my life. Gerald passed 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We had 34 years together, and I will not pretend I recovered from losing him quickly or gracefully. I did not. But I had my daughter, Lily, and I had the house Gerald and I built together on 3 acres outside Asheville, and I had the pharmacy I'd run independently for 19 years. I had enough. More than enough, if I'm honest. Gerald had been careful and quiet about money in the way that people who grew up without it tend to be. Between the house, the business, and what he left behind, I was comfortable. I did not discuss the specifics with anyone. Not my sister, not my closest friends. Certainly not Lily's boyfriends. Lily was 26 when she met him. His name was Caleb. She introduced him to me on a Sunday afternoon in October, and he arrived with flowers. Not grocery store flowers, the arranged kind from an actual florist, and a firm handshake and a smile so wide and so constant that by the time he left 4 hours later, I realized I had never once seen it falter. Not when Lily spilled iced tea on the kitchen table. Not when I asked him a question he hesitated to answer. The smile stayed perfectly in place like something laminated. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself that Gerald had been charming too, and that charm was not a crime. Caleb was 31, originally from Knoxville, Tennessee, working as a commercial real estate consultant. He spoke confidently about markets and investment cycles and mixed-use developments, the kind of language that sounds impressive until you realize it contains very few concrete facts. He had an apartment in downtown Asheville and drove a car that was slightly too new for someone his age. These were not red flags exactly. They were just details I filed away, the way I file away everything. The first real flag came 6 weeks into their relationship, during Thanksgiving dinner in my house. We were finishing the meal, and I had just mentioned offhandedly that I needed to reseal the back porch before winter. Caleb looked up from his plate and said, "Is that on the main property or the additional lot?" I set down my fork. "What additional lot?" He smiled. That same even smile. "Lily mentioned you have acreage. I was just curious about the layout." Lily was looking at her plate. She hadn't mentioned it to him in front of me before. I said, "Just the one parcel, 3 acres with the house." And I changed the subject. Later that night, after Caleb had gone and Lily was helping me with the dishes, I asked her casually what she told him about the property. She shrugged. "Just that you owned the house and some land." "Why?" I told her it was nothing, but I stood at that sink and I turned it over in my mind very carefully, the way I turn over an unfamiliar prescription, looking for interactions. He asked about the property twice more before Christmas. Once when we were walking the back perimeter and he stopped at the tree line and said, "Where does your land end?" Once when he helped me bring boxes down from the attic and paused at the window overlooking the yard. "This whole hillside is yours." Both times the question was light, casual, wrapped in aberration. Both times I answered simply and did not elaborate. I started paying attention differently after that. I noticed that Caleb always arrived early when Lily wasn't home yet, and always accepted my offer of something to drink, and always stayed in the kitchen while I prepared it. I noticed that he asked questions about my health with a frequency that didn't match the concern of someone who had known me for 2 months. "Are you sleeping okay? You look tired. Have you seen your doctor lately?" I noticed that he had an excellent memory for everything I said about myself, and almost no memory for anything Lily told him about her own week. In February, Lily told me they were getting serious. She was glowing when she said it, the way she used to glow on Christmas morning when she was small, and I pressed my feelings down deep and told her I was happy for her. In March, something happened that I have not told anyone until now. I had a cup of tea on the kitchen counter. I stepped outside to check the mail, and when I came back in, Caleb was standing at the counter with his back to me. He turned around when he heard me come in, and the smile appeared immediately. "I was just looking for a coaster," he said. I smiled back. I sat down. I picked up my tea. I am a pharmacist. I have spent 31 years noticing things that don't belong. And what I noticed as I lifted that cup was that the color of my tea was very slightly different than I remembered. Not dramatically, not obviously, just a shade too pale, as though something had been added that diluted it marginally. I set the cup down. I said I'd changed my mind about tea and offered Caleb a coffee instead. And while I made the coffee with my back to him, I thought very carefully about what I was and was not willing to believe. That night, I poured the remaining tea into a small container and sealed it. I have a colleague, a woman I went to pharmacy school with, who now runs a toxicology lab in Charlotte. I called her the next morning. I told her I needed a favor and that I would explain later. She tested the sample. She called me back in 4 days. There was a measurable trace of a benzodiazepine. A low dose, not enough to incapacitate, but enough, she said, to cause drowsiness, mild confusion, memory softness. Enough, if administered consistently over time, to make someone seem to be declining. Enough to make a 63-year-old woman look like she was losing her sharpness. I sat with that information for a long time. I did not panic. I am not a woman who panics. I am a woman who plans. I did not tell Lily. I want to explain that decision because I know it is the one that will divide people. Lily loved him. Truly, fully loved him. If I had come to her in March with a toxicology report and told her I believed Caleb was quietly drugging her mother to establish a pattern of cognitive decline, that I believed he was building a case to eventually challenge my competency and position himself near my estate, she would not have believed me. Not because she was foolish, because she was in love, and love has its own very effective chemistry. Instead, I called my attorney. His name is Robert, and he has handled my business affairs for 15 years, and he is the least dramatic person I have ever met, which is exactly what I needed. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to know everything about Caleb before I do anything at all." Robert hired a private investigator. I want to be specific about this because the comments on stories like mine always ask why the protagonist didn't just Google him. I'd Googled him. Caleb had a LinkedIn, a modest social media presence, a clean surface. What the investigator found was underneath the surface. Caleb had a previous girlfriend in Knoxville, a woman 12 years older than him, a widow who owned commercial property. They had dated for 14 months. She had updated her will during the relationship. They broke up 2 months before she died unexpectedly of a cardiac event at 58. There was no investigation. There was no reason for an investigation at the time. There was simply a woman who had changed her estate documents and then died. I read that report 3 times. Then I put it in Robert's safe. I also, very quietly, changed the location of every original document connected to my assets. Deed to the house, pharmacy ownership papers, investment account information. I moved them to Robert's office. At home, I left copies, good copies, convincing copies, but copies. If Caleb was looking, which I suspected he was, I wanted him to find something. I wanted him to believe he had found what he was looking for. In June, Lily came to me with a ring on her finger. She was crying happy tears before she even got through the door. I held her for a long time. I told her he was a lucky man. I told her I loved her. All of that was true. That night alone, I allowed myself 20 minutes of something that felt close to grief. Then I made a list of everything I still needed to do. The wedding was planned for the following April. A venue outside Asheville, 200 guests, late afternoon ceremony, dinner reception. Lily handled most of the planning herself. She is organized and capable and has her father's attention to detail, and watching her plan that wedding was one of the most bittersweet things I have ever experienced. In October, 7 months before the wedding, something shifted. Lily called me on a Tuesday evening sounding strange, flat in a way that she is not normally flat. She said Caleb had suggested that, since they were getting married, it might make sense for her to be added to my pharmacy's ownership documents. Just for continuity, she said, repeating a phrase that sounded rehearsed. He said it's what responsible families do. I was very quiet for a moment. Then I said, "That's an interesting thought. Let me talk to Robert about the right way to handle it." I called Robert the next morning. He agreed with what I already believed. Caleb was accelerating. He had moved from information gathering to action. The question was no longer whether he was a danger. The question was how to stop him completely, in a way that could not be undone or recovered from. Robert and I met with a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit of the Asheville Police Department. We brought the toxicology report. We brought the investigator's findings about the woman in Knoxville. We brought documentation of every question Caleb had asked about my property, logged with dates because I had written them down as they happened. The detective was a woman in her 40s named Sandra, and she sat across from us and read everything without expression. And when she finished, she said, "We'll need more." but this is a start. We built it carefully. Robert had a contact at the estate attorney's office that Caleb had quietly visited twice. We later confirmed he had inquired about the process for contesting a will on grounds of diminished capacity. Sanders' team quietly gathered additional information about the Knoxville woman's case. We waited. And then I did something deliberate. I called Caleb directly, which I had rarely done before. I told him I had been thinking about Lily's suggestion regarding the pharmacy ownership, and that I'd decided he was right, that family should be involved, and that I'd like to have a conversation with both of them before the wedding to discuss it properly. I heard the change in his breathing before he responded. A slight quickening, barely perceptible, gone within a second. "That sounds really mature of you, Margaret," he said. "Really mature." I thanked him. I hung up. I sat in my kitchen and I thought about the woman in Knoxville, and I thought about Lily, and I thought about Gerald, who loved this house and this land and trusted me to protect what we had built. And I decided that if Caleb wanted a stage, I would give him one. 3 weeks before the wedding, I told Lily that I had a small gift for her, something old, the traditional kind. I gave her a brooch that had belonged to my mother, a small silver piece with a sapphire center. I told her I would love it if she could work it into her bouquet somehow, tucked among the flowers the way brides used to do with sentimental keepsakes. She teared up immediately and said, of course she would. I also, privately, told her something else. I sat with my daughter in her apartment and I looked at her directly and I said, I need to tell you something important about Caleb, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond. And I told her. Everything. The tea, the toxicology report, the Knoxville woman, the estate attorney inquiries. I put the documents in her hands and I watched her read them. She did not cry. She went very still in the way she has been still since she was a little girl, when something was too large to process quickly. Then she asked me one question. What do we do? I told her. We agreed that she would tell no one, including her closest friends. We agreed that she would continue as planned, and we agreed on a signal. If, at any point during the ceremony, Lily needed me to act, she would find the brooch in her bouquet and pass it to me. April came the way April does, in the mountains. Cool and bright, the redbuds blooming along the ridge, the kind of day that feels designed to be remembered. The venue was beautiful. 200 people in their finest clothes, white chairs arranged in rows along a hillside, a string quartet playing something I recognized but couldn't name. I sat in the front row on the bride's side. I wore a deep green dress that Gerald always said made me look like myself. I had not slept more than 3 hours the night before. I watched Caleb take his place at the altar, and I watched that smile, that even, laminated smile, sweep over the crowd like a searchlight, landing on faces, radiating warmth. He caught my eye and held it for a moment, and I smiled back steadily, and he looked away first. Lily came down the aisle on the arm of her uncle, my late husband's younger brother, and she was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. She was luminous. She looked like her father on the day I married him, that same quality of being fully present in a moment, lit from somewhere internal. She reached the altar. The officiant began. I folded my hands in my lap and I breathed. At the moment when the officiant asked if anyone had objections, Lily's hand moved to her bouquet. She removed the brooch, slowly, as though straightening a flower, and she stepped slightly to the side and pressed it into my hand. I stood up. The room went silent the way rooms do when something has broken from the script. 200 people turned to look at me. Caleb's smile did not disappear. It shifted, contracted at the edges in a way that someone who hadn't been studying it for 14 months would not have noticed. But I noticed. I said clearly and without rush, I'm sorry to interrupt. My name is Margaret, I'm Lily's mother, and before the ceremony continues, there is something this room needs to know. I heard the intake of breath from the guests. I heard someone whisper. I kept my eyes on Caleb. I told them. I did not use dramatic language. I stated facts in the order they occurred. The questions about the property, the tea, the toxicology results, the woman in Knoxville, the visits to the estate attorney. I had a folder with me. Robert had suggested it, and I held it up and said that law enforcement had been notified and that Detective Sandra was, in fact, present at the venue. She stepped forward from the back row. Caleb's smile was gone. He tried to speak twice. The first time, nothing came out. The second time, he said, "This is absurd," and his voice was wrong, too high, too fast. One of the groomsmen took a step away from him. Another one looked at the floor. Sandra walked to the front and spoke briefly and quietly to Caleb. He was escorted out of the venue. He did not make a scene. I've thought about that since, that even then, leaving, he was calculating. That the scene would not have served him. The room was absolutely still. Then Lily walked down from the altar and took my hand. and someone near the back began to clap. And then more people joined, and I stood there holding my daughter's hand in front of 200 people on a cool April afternoon, and I thought of Gerald, and I thought, I kept it. I kept all of it. The land and the house and the thing that matters more than either. I kept her. We did not have a wedding that day. We had something else instead. A long, strange, tender afternoon where people cried and ate the catered food, came up to us one by one to say things they perhaps would never have said at a standard reception. Lily's college roommate told her she had always had doubts. One of the older guests, a retired judge who had known Gerald, took my hand and said simply, "Well done." I drove home that evening alone. I sat on the back porch, the one I'd resealed before winter, and looked out at the tree line where Caleb had once stood, asking where my land ended. It ends right there, I thought. At the tree line. Same as it always has. Caleb was formally charged several weeks later. Fraud, attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and a separate investigation was opened regarding the woman in Knoxville. I am not a vindictive person. I do not spend time hoping for a particular outcome in the courts. I spent my energy on Lily, who needed time and space, and her mother, and I gave her all of those things. She is doing well now. She has started seeing a therapist, which I encouraged. She laughs in her old way, the big unguarded laugh she's had since she was 4 years old. She came to the pharmacy last month and sat at the counter the way she used to when she was small, swinging her feet, drinking ginger ale, telling me about her week. I stood on the other side of the counter and listened, and the afternoon light came through the front window the way it does in October, golden and thin, and I thought, this is enough. This has always been enough. If you are watching this and you have a daughter, or a mother, or someone you love who is older and alone and owns something worth taking, please hear me. The danger does not always arrive loudly. It does not announce itself. It arrives with flowers from an actual florist, and a firm handshake and a smile that never quite reaches its own eyes. It arrives asking small questions and remembering every answer. Pay attention to what people ask about. Pay attention to how often they ask. And trust the thing in your chest that notices even before your mind has caught up to what it's noticed. I noticed. And I chose justice.